So what we're going to talk about today is the reverse of what we've been talking about in section 6.2. So today we're going to talk about lesson 6.3. And instead of saying it is a parallelogram, now we're going to prove that it's a parallelogram. So we know that there's 5 things that make, like 5 properties of a parallelogram. And so we're going to use those 5 properties to prove that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. Okay, so these are the 5. So there's 5 ways. Okay, so the first way is if both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So if we notice here, we've got the arrows, and these arrows mean that those lines are parallel. So if you looked at a picture and you saw that both pairs of sides are parallel, then it is a parallelogram. Okay, the next way is if both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Okay, so we know that, right? We know that the opposite sides in a parallelogram are congruent. So if they showed you a picture where both sides are congruent, then we know it's a parallelogram. Now, if they gave me a picture and only one side was congruent, then it wouldn't be a parallelogram. Okay, it has to be both pairs of sides congruent. Okay, so not a parallelogram. Okay, for number 3, if both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. So we can see here by the markings that both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. So again, if they show me a picture and both pairs are congruent, then we know it's a parallelogram. Okay, the next thing, if they show me a picture and they show that the diagonals bisect each other, remember when we bisect, these two are going to be congruent and these two are going to be congruent. So if I see a picture that looks like that, it means that the diagonals bisect each other. It is a parallelogram. And then finally, so this one is a little bit different, but it works anytime we have we're trying to prove a parallelogram. So it says if one pair of sides is both congruent and parallel. So if we look here, we can see that these arrows mean that the lines are parallel, and these tick marks mean that the lines are congruent. So if one pair of sides is both congruent and parallel. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is we're going to look at different pictures and we're going to say, yes, it is a parallelogram, or no, it is not a parallelogram. Okay, on your homework, you're going to do the same thing. So if these 5 things happen, one of these 5 things happen, then I can say it's a parallelogram. Okay, so it says, can you prove that the quadrilateral is a parallelogram based on the given information? So look at number 1. What do they tell us? We know that we have 2 pairs of opposite sides congruent. Is that a parallelogram? Yes. Okay, looking at number 2. All we know is that one pair of opposite angles are congruent. Is that enough to prove that it's a parallelogram? No. Okay, for number 3, we know 2 things. We know that these lines are parallel. We also know that they're congruent. So if we look up here, that's exactly like this last way that we can prove a parallelogram. So yes, this is a parallelogram. For number 4, what do they tell us? We know that these 2 are congruent. We know that these 2 are congruent. So what that means is that the diagonals bisect each other. So yes, this is a parallelogram. Okay, for number 5, they show me that these angles are congruent and these angles are congruent. So that both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. So yes, this is a parallelogram. Okay, for number 6, we see that these 2 sides are parallel. These 2 sides are parallel. When both pairs of sides are parallel, yes, it is a parallelogram. Okay, so we're gonna, these 5 ways are the only ways that we can prove a parallelogram. It's the reverse of the 5 properties that we already know about a parallelogram, okay? And we look at the pictures and we determine, can this be a parallelogram? Okay, so let's look here. So determine whether each quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So we've got parallel, the same side is congruent. Yes, this is a parallelogram. For number 2, we've got congruent angles, another set of congruent angles, they're opposite. Yes, this is a parallelogram. Okay. For number 3, all I know is that one pair of sides is congruent, so no, this is not a parallelogram. In order for it to be a parallelogram, I need both sides congruent. Looking at number 4, I know that these 2 sides are congruent. I know that these 2 sides are congruent, so yes, this is a parallelogram. Okay, for number 1, so now it says, for what values of x and y must each figure be a parallelogram? Okay, so now we're going to use those properties. So when we look at these, we want to use the same variable. Okay, so we're going to use x's and we're going to use y's. Okay, well, in order for this to be a parallelogram, what would have to happen with these 2 angles? We know that those 2 angles would have to be supplementary. So we're going to do 4y plus 2y equals 180. So we get 6y equals 180, so that y equals 30. Looking at this set of angles, again, if this was going to be a parallelogram, we would need to know that these are supplementary. So we're going to do x plus 5x minus 180 equals 180. So we've got 6x minus 180. We have to add 180 to both sides. So we get 6x equals 360. So x equals 60. So what this tells me is that when y equals 30 and x equals 60, this figure up here is a parallelogram. For number 2, if this is a parallelogram, we know, or what would have to happen is these 2 sides would need to be congruent, and these 2 sides would need to be congruent. So we're going to set up 2 equations. We're going to say 4x equals 3x plus 5, and then we're going to say y plus 3 equals 2y minus 1. So we're going to over here, sorry, change the color. We're going to subtract 3x, so we get x equals 5. Over here, we're going to subtract y, so we get 3 equals y minus 1. We're going to add 1, so we get y equals 4. So what this tells us, when x equals 5 and y equals 4, this figure is a parallelogram. Okay, for this one, actually these last 2 we're not going to do right now. We're going to look at numbers 1 and 2 more on Monday. Your homework is going to focus on questions like these, as well as questions like these. So you've taken notes. You want to refer back to this to do your homework.